In the previous chapter, we talked about what might be an overly simplistic dichotomy between EM and DM classifications. There's another dichotomy that gets a lot of airtime by institutional investors, especially when it comes to tech investing, B2B versus B2C, or as Hamlet put it, to be or not to be. But is the B2B versus B2C distinction the right way to look at emerging markets? Or, like EM and DM, is there a bit more beneath the surface? To delve into this, I spoke with Swapnil Chichani. Swapnil grew up across India and the Middle East before getting admitted to IIT Bombay, one of the flagship IIT campuses in India. He later joined Uber, where he was a key part of its growth in India. After getting his MBA at Kellogg, he moved to Singapore to work at BCG. He's now part of the Asia Partners team in Singapore. Swapnil, great to see you. What is your perspective on the B2B versus B2C question that gets so much attention in the US tech investing circles?
Thanks, Nancy. It's a question that makes complete sense given where the US is right now in terms of how its tech market has evolved, but it's actually a fairly narrow question from the standpoint of Asia. We first wrote about this in our 2021 report, our second, and talked about how the primary distinction in Asia, and in fact in almost all emerging markets worldwide, is actually between telcos and non-telcos. Then within non-telcos, the B2B versus B2C dichotomy starts to become more relevant. In terms of absolute value creation for markets like ours, the largest player for many years, even until recently, have been the telcos. And the steady rotation of shareholder value away from telcos and towards the newer TMT business models, which is represented by the green arrow above. This has been a very important theme for many emerging markets. If you're looking at it from a US lens, it's almost like you have to roll back the clock on how venture capital worked in the 1950s or 60s, well before Marble was broken up in the US and well before the software industry IPOs of the 80s. At one point in the US, Marble, or AT&T, was one of the most valuable TMT companies in the country, and indeed the world. Then came the breakup into the baby bells, and in parallel a massive wave of new tech innovation. There are dozens of subsegments of the tech, media, telecoms, or the TMT landscape, but to simplify things, let's boil down to 8 core segments. Telcos at the 11 o'clock position, and then in clockwise fashion, hardware, semiconductors, data and data processing, IT services, software, internet and e-commerce, and traditional media, the M in the TMT. Think of these as food groups or ingredients. They're all important, but each country or region in the world has a rather different recipe for how much of each ingredient to use. We can analyze how those recipes differ. Let's start with a global mix of equity value by ingredient. Think of this as the grocery store inventory. And each country is like a different family selecting different ingredients to bring home based on their unique recipes and preferences. On a global basis, at year-end 2022, the world's TMT equity value was 10% telcos, 19% hardware, 14% semiconductors, 8% data and data processing, 21% internet and e-commerce, 5% IT services, 19% software, and 3% traditional media. That's very different from what the weightings were in 2005, and you can see how the mix of telco has fallen by 2/3 globally from 30% to 10%, while software during the same period has almost doubled from 10% to 19%. And internet e-commerce have not quite tripled from 8% to 21%. But each family gathers the ingredients for a different recipe. If we look at the ingredient mixes across different parts of the world, they over-index or under-index quite dramatically from the global mix. For example, North America under-indexes quite dramatically on telco market cap, whereas over-indexes on software and data processing. That's why we think many American institutional investors think about the B2B versus B2C distinction rather than the telco versus non-telco distinction. The telco lens was a lot less relevant after the 1984 and the baby bells. Then take a look at Western Europe. IT services is much more relevant, as is traditional media and telcos. ASML shows up in semiconductors here. China is a fascinating example. It indexes fairly closely to the global mix with 3 major differences. 1, virtually no data and data processing market cap. Recall that Ant's IPO was put on hold and China UnionPay is still privately held. Relatively little software here and a 1.9x over-indexing on consumer internet and e-commerce. South Asia is vastly different from almost every other part of the world. Surprisingly so, given the amount of venture capital that has gone into consumer internet companies. It under-indexes on virtually every category other than lightly over-indexing on telcos, at least for now, and massively over-indexing on IT services. TCS is the country's second largest public company at a 152 billion market cap, and Infosys is number 4 at 77 billion, which finally brings us back home to Southeast Asia. It's different from China and from India. Like China, we vastly under-index on data and data processing, but what's really remarkable is how much we over-index on telcos by 5x the global mix. We also over-index on traditional media. Now that C, Grab, and others are public, we match the global mix of consumer internet, but we are still behind China's mix of consumer internet, which gives us a lot of optimism for that sector in Southeast Asia over the coming years. What we will see in a moment is that Southeast Asia today looks remarkably like China 10 years ago, which is, in its own sort of way, a sort of time machine for that we might look like in the coming years. You can see these trends more visibly and over time by looking at each country or region in a sequence. This exhibit shows the equity value mix of North America by sector. The trends have been fairly consistent over the past 2 decades, with the mix from telcos, traditional media, and IT services continuing to fall, internet and software rising, and semiconductor and hardware modestly down. Europe feels a bit like the US, but a few decades shifted in time, with the telcos mix in 2022 where North America was in 2005. Although culturally part of the West, Australia is even more shifted in time, with telcos still 40% of the TMT market cap and a missing hardware and semiconductor sector. In contrast, as we shift to Asia, we see where a lot of that global hardware and semiconductor market cap is coming from. South Korea's mix is almost 70% hardware and semiconductors, and remarkably just 3% telcos. There's probably a link between the rapid ubiquitous broadband in Korea and competition among the triopoly of Korea Telecom, LG, and SK Telecom. Japan is a bit more than 40% hardware and semiconductors, though as we pointed out in our 2021 report, its telcos have been remarkably resilient, much more so than, let's say, Korea. Taiwan is a great example of a semiconductor specialist, and in fact, over 90% of its total market cap comes from hardware and semiconductors, with a dusting from everything else. The biggest part of that 90% is TSMC, one of the world's most valuable companies. What Taiwan is to semiconductors, India is to IT services. In fact, far from being commoditized by cloud and AI, as was occasionally feared, India's IT services mix has grown from 60% in 2005 to 69% in 2022. But look at how the internet contribution is, just 6%. This is a direct consequence, we believe, of India not yet being in the golden age of affluence. Once it approaches $4,000 of GDP per capita in 2023 dollar terms, that will grow substantially, in parallel with its IT services industries, perhaps becoming less cost competitive. The rest of the world's emerging markets fit a common theme here. Telcos slowly losing ground. This trend vastly outweighs the B2B and B2C distinction, which becomes more relevant over time. You can see this playing out in Eastern Europe, with a very impressive showing by both software and consumer internet. Ditto in Latin America, where Mercado Libre has built a classic CAD3 bonsai business, giving Amazon a run for its money. And also in Africa and MENA, though it's worth pointing out that some of this is actually indirect exposure to China through Naspers.
Where does that leave China and Southeast Asia?
There's a lot happening in China, with almost 20 billion of nominal GDP. That's a lot you can build. China is one of the world's most diversified tech ecosystems, comparable in some ways to the world as a whole, but with consumer internet over-indexed relative to global mix, and software and data processing under-indexed. Which brings us to Southeast Asia. Remember that green arrow from the beginning? The one where telcos lost market cap and non-telcos gained? That was in Southeast Asia from 2005 to 13. In fact, telcos gained market cap during that period of time. But starting in 2014, perhaps due to the ongoing telco competition, or perhaps because of 4G mobile coverage starting to percolate through the region, telcos started to lose ground and non-telcos started to grow. That continued until 2022 when there was a contraction for both. In many ways, Southeast Asia looks like many of other emerging markets we just talked about. Telcos slowly in decline and consumer internet growing more recently. The big moves between 2021 and 2022 are largely linked to C's reduction in market cap from its late 2021 peak. The point that we find very interesting is that Southeast Asia's mix in 2022 looks remarkably like China's in 2012. There's no guarantee that they will end up converging over time, but based on the periodic table that Oliver shared, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Southeast Asia will look more and more like China over time, at least in terms of mix. And a major part of that, we think, could be semiconductors, which we will talk about next.